Well, I was actually talking to my spiritual director today.
Mm,
Um, and it was really interesting because I mean, even Espasea brought it up to me in the last conversation that I heard. I don't know if it's in the video. I don't know if it's included in the video. It might be. It's towards the end. She tells me that she would like to have a conversation with me later on about grief, about that kind of emotion,
yeah, yeah.
because it's a very unique one. And I was talking to, my spiritual director, Mark Murphy, about it.
Oh,
And there's something very interesting he said to me, which was like, he said, grief makes you tired. There's a certain point that I guess there's a certain point where grief makes you tired. And then he says, well, the problem with calling it a feeling is then, like, I agree with him. It doesn't capture, maybe feeling doesn't capture. And then he says, and then it's odd when you use it as process, because if you say grief is a process, then you assume it can be closed, right? Like it's going to be healed, right? It's something you're processing. Right. So it's very interesting the words that we're using to talk about grief when I think the words that we came up with just more like this kind of like holding, a different way of holding the wounds, so to speak. One of my buddies doesn't read philosophy. He said, moving on is a horrible word. And I agree with him because I was like, moving on doesn't actually make any sense. Doesn't that doesn't actually feel like what happens. Um, it feels more like learning to live with, right? Which is the word. But it's very interesting. And, it's like, it reminds me of Heidegger's talk about death, where there's a sense in which things look healed or things are moving on, but that's actually that's you just becoming preoccupied with life again, really. To be fundamentally honest, that's really what it is, right?
hmm.
So it's kind of like it seems like things are fine, but things are under the surface. They're kind of the same. Is just when your attention is not occupied, that's when they have a tendency to spark up, right? So in that sense, moving on doesn't really make sense. Or it's not. I've been thinking about that. I don't really have any solid takes.
No, I love that. So there's a few things. Um, I think it is extremely important to first identify that grief is not merely a feeling, it has motivational consequences. I think in the
Mm,
same
mhm,
way that we tend to say, oh, you're thinking like a brain on a stick or something like that, where you
mhm,
separate thinking. We actually kind of do that with feelings, where we separate feelings from emotions and thoughts, and we're maybe a heart on a stick or something, actually. And Mr. Jockin, good to see you. And, because we treat as if feelings are isolated from a system of activity of the body and that you can change them on a dime, right? But
yes.
really, I think feelings are we're not brains on sticks and we're not heart on sticks, I suppose. And heart and emotions, I guess, also to me, in the same way that if a car is moving, if you slam on the brakes, you can be in a wreck and get damaged, right? Like you don't just slam on the
Mhm,
brakes. You find a parking lot, you don't do it in the middle of the road, you get hit, you slow down. Well, for me, the reason why I really agree strongly with emotions having a certain movement is because you have to think about treating or addressing them. The word, of course, I like is address. You have to address them like you would address anything moving, not something stagnant.
mhm,
So how do you address something
mhm,
moving, right? Well,
mhm,
if it depends on the weight. A small child, you could maybe just grab, but if it was a grown man, it may run you over. If it was running towards you versus falling at you, like the situation determines the correct address for the thing moving, right? And I
mhm,
think, the size of the loss impacts how you would catch it or that you would meet
mhm,
it. Because I think, like you're saying, language like moving on. Yeah, I think most people confuse busyness with healing. They confuse not thinking about with healing, which of course is repression and fragile and different things like that. But there's something more like meeting or catching or observing or a word I like is weaving. There's something about grief where it has to be situated into a certain weaving. I mean, honestly, there's a way in which it's changing how you see the grief, at least for me, where it suddenly
Mhm.
becomes part of something not arbitrary. And I would even say that you're healed from, grief is to be sublated into the beautiful, ultimately, which,
Mhm.
because then you can see it as shining forth part of something. Now, of course, how in the world do you take something terrible and structure it or weave it into the possibility of a strike of beauty? Well, but that's the work, right? Like that's
Right.
kind of because often we confuse overcoming grief with forgetting or busyness, right? And
Jockin's ready.
and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. But I think for one, the first thing, and Michelle, good to see you. If we think about emotions as moving,
Mhm.
well, then that totally transform. How do you address things that are moving? You meet them, you
Mhm.
get it, you get your velocity up, you figure out the situation. The way we talk about emotions are as if they are not located in a network of other causal effects or environment. We basically talk about emotions like heart on sticks in the same way that many intellectuals have fallen to the mistake of heads on a stick, if you will. If we're not careful, the way we talk about emotions can be like hearts on sticks. And then, of course, wherever Aspasia is, I hope she hears this, there's also the raw facticity of the emotion as being distinct from the response to it. And if you feel guilty about feeling the emotion, that seems very problematic. And maybe the reason why is because you're meeting, for me, the word guilt is very unmoving, like you're frozen,
Mhm.
right? Well, if you're
Mhm.
frozen and emotion is something moving, well, that's the exact worst thing you can do. If you freeze to catch something moving, well, it will knock you over, right? Like, certainly, martial arts tries to move with or curve with, not be stagnant. So perhaps a reason why guilt is often not the proper address, even if there can be some places for it. I don't want a society where people don't feel guilt for murder, for example. It just depends on what we mean. There's something about guilt that has a certain freezing up that would, and if
Mhm.
emotions are moving, then it would tackle you, it would take you down, right? And that, of course, makes me think about, well, if the universe is curving and all the stuff we were saving last week, well, this would be fitting for how things actually are as a certain curving and weaving. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you, sir.
There we go. Good to see everybody. By the way, Daniel, this is so appropriate timing because I just wrote a Substack post on this exact topic. So this is outstanding timing.
Perfect.
Yeah, because I think to add what you're saying, Daniel, I think a big note is I wrote about athletics and dealing with motion. Immediately, I'm thinking in boxing, the most sophisticated form of it is what's called counterpunching. So that's actually using the force that's coming at you in a keto kind of way to not only dodge it, but then also be offensive with it at the same time. Uh, so it's actually this much more sophisticated approach as opposed to a blunt either avoidance or taking on the impact. It's working with it and responding to it. Uh, I think as I wrote in those Substack posts, this idea of that the absolute abyssal state of suffering, and actually, by the way, this note of guilt and shame. Actually, the Greek for shame is actually the word for ugly. I mean, it's fine. So it's that because the kalos can be. There are times in Aristotle and Plato where they use it against badness, right? There is that example. So thus is why people assume it's exactly equivalent to goodness. But there are times where there's a special contrariness to kalos that is it's translated to be shame. Um, and that shame aspect actually that has I talked about this in the beauty course. It has this kind of quality of frozenness, loss of flow. That's like this all correspond to your notions about beauty, and that's what we're getting at. And I wrote in the Substack post, it, the absolute test is in a great moment of suffering, an abyssal state of appearance of nothing. The response to say that's a lack, not a nothing. And by saying lack, they meaning to create a possibility for a new direction. And I just use a very toy example. I use a toy example that I've seen my friends of mine mourning the loss of their children as they develop from infants to toddlers. And I pointed out that it's both absolutely rational. It's perfectly reasonable to have that mourning because there is a good that you're losing. But if you notice, that's because there's a fixation on the known loss versus the new possibility. I only say that because in the development form of a child, moving from each phase of development, that is a unified soul, like a unified form for that whole event or proceeding occurring. And I just say that because let's imagine the scenario if that was cut off, meaning child passed away. The mourning would be immense, and it'd be such a magnitude of a lack present in your life from that point on. At every moment going forward, you're doing the cross reference. So this child could have been here right now. I could just imagine that in my own head, just thinking through that possibility. So that really touches on what we're getting at here, is that when we're doing mourning, especially if there's a sense of guilt or shame attached to it, you're frozen, you're locked in, you're completely locked into the known loss as opposed to what is the potential gain or potential possibility of another direction. And Dana, I think you're absolutely right, because actually in our book we're working on together, and we haven't talked much about it publicly, but with Luber's here too. I think a very big part of it, and I was working through the exercise part of it, was this: you need to when you come to this abyssal moment of a real betrayal, or a sense of you let yourself down, or let someone you cared about down, or something important to you is let down. What do you do with that mourning? You actually are in a state, that kind of pained souled state of you don't even know what to do with yourself. It takes a great creative soul to be willing to transform that. And that's why it's part of beauty, because it has that power to retroactively completely transform what was the loss in your life, the real deprivations and the failures, and transform it into something very radically different. And it's very easy to, of course, it's always a problem with beauty. It's very easy to do it retroactively, meaning like you already went through it and you did it. It's a whole other exercise to ask someone in that abyssal state to do that transformation, to ask what if, what could be. You can actually probably imagine people would be that resistance. I think I've actually a big note too, besides frozenness, stiffness, rigidness, is a kind of resistance, right? There's a strong emotional, like the emotions are signs, no? That's basically what they are. Now, always a problem with signs is they could be multiple confounding factors. That's why human beings are so complicated. Because you actually brought up the note, Daniel, people actually get into their minds as kind of, I'm not supposed to feel this way. So it's not even just about the emotion, it's the response to the feeling of the emotion in the first place. So we have like confounding second order properties on the same thing. Yeah. So that causes almost like a noise factor. So what exactly even what the emotion is, because you cannot attach it to what's the exact cause of it. I think sometimes, I'm sure not the only person, sometimes you don't even know why you're upset. You don't even know. You have to talk it through to even realize what was the thing that even got you upset in the first place. So I think I agree. I do like this note also of the heart on a stick versus a head on a stick. Like, I think it's good. Both are missing something very important. It needs to be the unity of both. I think a lot of it has to do with that narrative, kind of if I almost had to call it a kind of counterpunching narrative of how can you present yourself in this condition that in true truth, this is, again, the closer you can get to like an absolute choice point about this. In all reality, yes, this person is gone. Yes, this failure occurred. Yes, you did this bad thing, whatever that is. I think also this actually relates to murder, right? That's the point, is that sometimes there are some evils that you've done that you will never be able to take back in this life, in this world. You can't do it. This is actually part of the reason why a theological account matters, because sometimes the restoration is not even possible in this world in a material manner. It has to record. You need to have these equipment of a larger account to even address these points in the first place. Otherwise, you're just going to be racking in real truth. There is no way to respond, especially if you lived and another person died, for example. So I'm thinking through that, and it is like this kind of counterpunch narrative that needs to be occurring to have this activity of beauty, and that requires not a repression or resistance. It's a full acknowledgement of the badness and the evilness and the harm, but it has to be. But it's not just a fixation; it's locked in, and that's now your retrospective perspective. That's now your perspective going forward for all time. Instead, it's the what if. I think it is language of like, how might we, how if, what if we invert, what's possible. I think the fact that most people in mourning are in real grief or in shame would be that resistance feeling is actually the sign of that. So these are great notes.
No, tremendous. And Mr. Lubert, it's good to see you. Well, for me, because I think about these things, and again, just to kind of carry some of the stuff we were talking about, curves and space and memory as having some sort of pull on the present, creating a certain curvature. For me, there's something about grief or the memory of, say, murdering something, where it's as if the past is pulling on the present to slow it down. Like it's slowing it down. And the more it is slowed down, the more it becomes entropic, dispersed, and it can't function. It's disordered, right? Where the pull is, in a sense, directly behind it, and it's slowing it down. And a lot of the name of the game to me is, if there is something about emotion in the human being, in motion, in movement, that is very, very important. Something that slows down is by definition killing. Like it's leading toward that's, slowing down in this sense is the opposite of life, right? Because by movement here, I'm thinking like the movement of life. I'm not saying taking a nap or something. But of course it manifests in those sort of losses of energy, right? And instead, what ends up happening is it seems to be a certain returning to the past on your terms versus, I think a lot of people try to overcome grief by speeding up. Like I'll outrun it, right? I'll get really busy and get away from it. But you see, actually, that just increases its force, so it pulls on you more, and you can't get away from it, right? And eventually you slow down and you go flat, you lose your geometry, and you go flat. Instead, what you have to do is curve around to it and come back to it, and then you get the repetition and the excess, right? And what that means is how do you curve to something in the past, where something in the past is a memory? Well, you have to change how you see it. Curvature is always a change in sight relative to the past, right? Because if it's directly behind you, that means you're not seeing it differently. You're seeing it the same way, right? What occurs? So it's just repeating, right? Well, you're not curving. You have a straight line. A straight line is equilibrium, and therefore you lose energy and you die. But when you curve to it, which means you're changing how you see it, that's how you curve. Well, now you have the possibility of an excess, a repetition in the Deleuzian sense. That's an excess. And for me, that's basically the creation of an excess in that Deleuzian sense is basically how you deal with negative emotions. Because otherwise, you're fighting them by trying to speed up. And that means you're using a lot of energy. And this, I guess I'm getting to Javier's point. What ends up happening is you get tired on grief, because very often you're using a lot of energy to hold the parts together or to speed out, and you get tired, right? So the address of grief has to be something that doesn't use as much energy. Well, that's where people are like, oh, well, forget about it then. Well, that doesn't work, because it actually is a lot of energy to repress it. It's a lot of energy to brainwash yourself, right? And to deny what you're feeling. So that doesn't work to maintain energy, right? The only way to maintain energy in a negentropic sense is curves, because the universe curves. So you have to curve to it, which means you have to change how you see, which means that we're dealing with something like seeing it in terms of beauty, weaving it into a different narrative, making it part of something where we're not trying to get away from it, but we're able to integrate it. Because in a sense, the opposite of repression is not actually just expression. A lot of people actually, in my opinion, they think the opposite of repression is expression. I don't think so. I think it's integration. I think the address of repression is integration. Now, what does it look like to integrate a difficult episode or something very difficult? Well, it's going to be a creative act. I mean, you made the point of, if you don't have divine judgment, it seems impossible to deal with great horrors. It makes me think of a very important book by Wolf, Volf, called Exclusion and Embrace, where he's trying to convince people who have been massacred, genocide, raped, pillaged in the Balkans. How do you forgive? How do you stop the endless cycle of revenge, right? Like, how do you do it? And the only way that what Wolf talks about, and he's talking to like these, middle class American Christian religious people, spiritual but not religious, is actually the only way you got to stop the cycles of violence is to say, well, actually, there's a divine judgment, and if they're truly evil, God will punish them. And they go, oh, okay, so there will be a divine punishment. There could be hell, so I don't need to take it. And actually, paradoxically, belief in divine judgment actually led to people going to peace, because you were able to put it in somebody else's hands. You were able to see it differently, right? Now, there's obviously dangers with that doctrine, but the point that he's getting at is they changed how they saw their responsibility. Because if you killed my wife, don't I have a kind of moral obligation to get revenge? It's like the Icelandic literature. Well, if God is going to take care of it, then you're actually not necessarily so morally obligated to take revenge. It changes how you see the situation, right? And so it changes how you approach it. And I think basically that kind of situation, it's just then along a gradient. When you find yourself in a cycle, because there's a difference between like a cycle you can't escape, it seems, and a creative repetition that leads to an excess. That tends to, for me, cycles, if I would use that language here, cycles tend to be very energy using because you're a hamster wheel. There's a difference between the hamster wheel, where you're using up all your energy, and it makes you tired, or you just have violent cycles and civilization dies, and the curve that returns to a point that leads to an excess. And I think at this point in the game, everything are these very fine, nuanced distinctions that have similar structures, but slight little difference that make all the difference. That's why I think at this point, in my opinion, at this point in the game, you start to see why philosophical training has such a role, because the most important things are just slightly different from the converse, which can be the worst of things. And if you don't pick up on that slight little difference, you could be in massive, massive trouble. But the point I was getting at on this, what leads to integration, you could argue, and I'll give it to Javier and Luber, what Wolf is saying is it's almost a creative act. They saw the story different. They saw the world different, and that helped them integrate. And you see all the time therapists and people talking about art and creativity leading to integration, philosophy, thinking through, talking out, talk therapy. You could argue all of these have some sort of creating a new framework in which to fit things, ergo some sort of creative act. And it does seem something about the creative act is inseparable from integration as opposed to mere expression. And then the kind of mind that is fluid in the capacities of integration are thus able to curve into their past to figure out how to work with these things, as opposed to fight against how it's pulling back, which ultimately just leads to geometry to flattening in different ways. So very, very well said, Mr. Jockin. I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Luber. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, this is like perfect stuff because like I talked to Mark Murphy, my spiritual director, about what I've been struggling with like I noticed I've been playing a lot of video games, but also been feeling guilt about it because I feel like I should be like writing more poetry or something. And it was funny. That's when Mark said that. That's when he said, well, uh, grief makes you tired. It's like grief makes you tired. So he's like, just play your video games. Um, and then he said something else about guilt as at the very least, it's an indicator that God is pulling on you, right? And that it's gonna like it was so weird the way he phrased it. I still sort of struggling to express it, but basically it was just kind of like this like waiting, right? Like you need to be able to wait. If you feel guilt, at least acknowledge that it's more about that there is a pulling, God is pulling towards you, right? He was, and that's really what matters versus he said something funny to me today. He's like, don't get caught up in that Catholic guilt, which I think is just a synonymous, a version of frozenness that he was talking about. Don't get caught up in that frozenness, which I do really sense that. I do really sense that frozenness, which was why I've always been hesitant about guilt, is that it does have that kind of detriment of frozenness, you know. Um, the other thing that you said, Daniel, which I thought was interesting, was repression expression. Thich Nhat Hanh said something very similar about, and I've actually experienced this too. People like talking about, I'm just venting. I just need to vent. But that's actually, if you think about movement in terms of emotion, all that does is just speeds up the ball, right? And it makes it more intense. And you don't even walk away feeling better per se, right? Like venting just like people say they feel better, but they're still angry at their partners, essentially. And I've had this experience where I didn't know, like, me and my partner were both venting essentially at each other. But there's a sense in which talking out eventually turns into venting, and then you just become exhausted, and then you just drop the conversation. And it makes it feel like it's like you talked it out, but you literally just talked yourselves to death, really. Like you're just so exhausted. You're just like, I'm like, I'm good, like I'm done, like let's just go to bed, kind of thing. So paying attention to emotions as movement, and then also how quickly or how easily talking can move into this kind of like exhaustion. Like we're just talking to the point of exhaustion, actually. We're not really like actually doing anything with this at all. Like we're not doing anything productive with this talking. So that means like just talking is not just itself productive. It's not a given that it itself is productive, which is um, really good to know. The other thing that really stood out to me was how difficult it is for human beings to determine where they are on a fundamental level. And I'm just going to use like spiritual level as just kind of like an assessment, because I was thinking about how weird this is, because I finished McCabe's book, God Still Matters. And he says, you should pray where you are. And he actually advocates for this, like, if you're new to prayer, just pray all the childish things that you want out of you, right? Pray for getting better grades, pray for, better body, whatever. Um, and that sounds like so not intuitive, but we have this idea of, oh, well, I gotta pray, but I'm gonna pray like a saint or whatever. I gotta pray like what a saint would want, right? But the thing is, you're not a saint, and he gives this equivalence, and this is why I like Jockin bringing up like development, which is spiritually we're still a child, and this is what is so like befuddling to me, is like, okay, so developmentally we've matured, right, into an adulthood, but with human beings it's very awkward because spiritually you can be very childish, I guess, versus childlike, so to speak. So I'm realizing like it's so hard to pin, because I think it's very important to pin this very point down, and it's very situational, which is determining where the person is in their spiritual growth. And that's very hard to determine, I feel like, on a fundamental level, because, and I think that also is what gets people confused about what they should do, what they should not do. And it's like, well, because I think about boxing all the time, right? Like it's very easy. I haven't done boxing, so I think I know where I would need to start. But it's like with spiritual stuff, it's like, well, where do I start? How do I go about it? And, spiritual direction has kind of, made that more clear to me about just like spiritual friendship matters, right? It brings, friendship into this. Um, because I think there's a version of guilt of you're not where you want to be, but you don't know where you are in that scale. Like you don't actually know where you're placed in that scale. And that's very hard to determine, I feel like. Um, and I think that's where I think that might make sense for the crisis, right? Meaning crisis. Like what like whatever anybody's, I think this is where Aristotle makes more sense, right? The medicine that I need doesn't fit where I am. I mean, it needs to fit where I am. The medicine that I need needs to fit where I am. The problem is I don't have anybody to diagnose where I am, right? But the more that I talk to like my spiritual director, the more I see that like, oh, I'm still like in the child like stage. Like I'm still like baby. Like I don't know. I'm still like sucking on God's teeth, like but anyways.
No, delightful and Christian and Steve, wonderful to see. Well, a few things. If indeed everything is a certain gestalt, then if you start anywhere, that's as good as everywhere. So there's a certain of just start seems to be half the battle, because if it is all a whole, if every part is the whole as a gestalt, then there is no starting point. Starting is a word of sequence. There's just a point. And so you just have a point. I think also I'm thinking, as Socrates, why is Socrates so smart? Because he knows nothing while other people don't. There's something about spiritual maturity that is knowing you're not spiritual mature while other people don't. That seems to be really important. But also to me, what's very critical, and I think this is sometimes not emphasized in my opinion. So in Socrates not knowing anything, what does Socrates do? Does he sit at a desk and write a treatise? No, he goes and meets people. He engages in dialogue. Actually, the step of Socrates from that is relationship, you could say, right? I think there's something similar to the spiritual, right? If you say, well, I have no idea what my spiritual thing, well, let me go encounter others, right? Problematically, I think, unfortunately, especially if you have, very often we can go to others to expose them and expose the shortness of their beliefs or whatever, as opposed to expose ourselves to them. And I think basically there's something about the first step of spiritual development, I would say human development, that is tied to switching from a mode of exposing others to exposing yourself to others, right? Now, I would argue that actually does require philosophical and mental training, because if you do that, you're in danger. You could be manipulated. This is where you need the self-defense we've talked about, right? Like there's a lot of people who are saying, well, let me go form community, that actually can go in not realizing that you could argue the most difficult and dangerous things in the world are relationships and people, right? So you go in kind of willy-nilly, and if you do that, that can lead to a lot of trouble, or the way you manage the community can be conformity to, banality of evil, givens, getting everyone to think the right way. So we know those are problems. So if we don't want relationships that have had that form, that have led to many troubles in history, then it would require coming into them with certain philosophical, mental, spiritual equipment. But then you use that equipment to hold it back almost. You use that equipment to make yourself, not to expose them, but to expose yourself to them. And that seems to have radical transformation. To me, without getting too much into it, that's what Anselm is mostly getting at, in my opinion. Karl Barth said that the ontological proof was a prayer. And the key is what Anselm is basically arguing, is that unless you're on your knees, the God that you say doesn't exist is not the God that exists. You can only talk about God existing or not existing from on your knees, right? Which means you assume God exists, which means you act as if God exists, right? Which, of course, you'd say, well, that seems to be stacking the deck in his favor, right? You'd be like, yes, but that's actually the case of all, in all honesty, that's all thought. You have to get on your knees before any thinking and be a student to it and assume that it is the case and humble yourself before it if you're in fact going to advance at all, right? So what Anselm is getting in my opinion, the ontological argument is actually a pedigree. It is actually a philosophy of education is actually embedded in it, which I think is actually the case. I'll give it to Mr. Luber and then Michelle. I think the last thing I'll say is there's almost a grace in that eventually you get exhausted. Like if we lack the capacity to integrate, it's almost like God's like, well, at least you'll get exhausted and the anger will go away if you talk it out. And you could argue it's better for people to talk and get exhausted than to not, but that's not as good as the integration, right? But integration is a particular kind of talking, right? And a particular way to, well, the word I would use, of course, is weaving, right? And I think also the revelation with that, Mr. Rivera, is you were talking about, well, play video games. I could hear Mr. Ebert saying, well, yeah, saturate, right? You play the video games to the point where you're saturated and then you don't want to do it anymore. Something that is very interesting to me, I can't imagine anything a single human being can do that would not eventually saturate you into moving on, per se, moving beyond it. At some point, you'll get bored with video games. At some point, you won't want to eat chocolate cake anymore. At some point, your most wonderful activity in the world, like fishing, becomes a torture to you if you're forced to do it for 10 years without stopping, right? So it would seem as if anything an individual can do eventually will saturate. So there's a natural motion, a natural movement of the individual. I wonder, I'm not so sure, though, if relationships saturate in the same way. They seem to, where the human being eventually exhausts yourself into a movement, between people, you can exhaust yourself to a stagnancy. And that might be because you're integrating a new ontology. It's a new vector, it's a new complexity, right? Saturation deals with the subject to the subject. But between people, you can have a saturation that's exhaustion, not integration. And it would seem as if when you're talking between people, there are different qualities of saturation, if you will. There's the saturation where you're saturated with the words into tiredness, and then there's the saturation that is actually integration. Both of those are transitions, but the character, the quality of the transition is different. And perhaps based on what we were saying last week with each transcendental emergence, the kinds of saturation that are afforded transform. And though they are quantifiably the same, you know, it's full, it's a new flat transition, they are qualitatively different. And perhaps qualitative assessments actually with higher complexity eclipse quantitative. And we move more and more in having to think of the qualitative, which actually is a return because it actually started with the qualitative in the first place, right? So it's interesting to think that. That must be expanded on, but let me give it to Mr. Luber, and then Michelle. Mr. Luber, is good to see you today. And if anyone has anything to say, please raise your hand. Mr. Luber.
Good to see you too. Yeah, that was great at the end. I do think Ebert would say that, and then it, your point about it being more quality, and then it ironically was always it always started with quality. It's this always already dimension, and like basically when you think of a a term like energy or revenge, you always want to make a distinction where part of the distinction is uh, already within that always already dimension. So like, for example, there's energy in, oh, I'm talking about something I'm so passionate about. The passion in the way I'm talking, there's a certain exertion of energy that's being used. And then you could also say, well, that's one angle to energy, and then there's another angle of energy, which is, oh my God, this conversation is tiresome. Like I've been exerting so much energy, and that angle, to my estimation, isn't succinct with the always already dimension, um, because the energy that is like that's conducive to this, oh, I'm just like passionately talking type of energy. Well, that has to do with the same type of passion or energy that started you on that trajectory in the first place, versus the other angle of energy. That energy is not what started you on that path in the first place. So right there, it's same thing with revenge. I'll do revenge. It's like, how do you get out of the cycle of revenge? Well, you start with what got you kind of on the path to revenge, and that's actually what gets you out of the cycle of the revenge, because the the angle that allows you to see revenge as also the starting place simultaneously is the only way to get out of the cycle. So quality in that sense emerges as as I don't like framing it like this, but just forgive me, as basically when you realize the doubleness in the points. You got 2 points. You got the recognition of a quality in the moment where it's like, oh, there's quality. There's the 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 term or the concept is in the forefront of my interface, so to speak, where it's like, oh, revenge, I got to think about revenge. Oh, there's guilt, I got to think about guilt. But in thinking about guilt, if you're thinking about it in terms of not being able to see how you started, how it started you on the path of guilt itself, then you're thinking about guilt wrong. Then you are thinking about it because in a wrong way in terms of quality. It's a bad quality of guilty that you're thinking about, and that it doesn't allow for this creative. I forget how Jockin framed it, but like the creative, one of you framed it. Maybe it wasn't Jockin, but like the creative, basically the creative way to like get out of it. so to speak. Where you see like, oh, the death of my, for example, for me, it's like, oh, well, the death of my grandma, actually, I'm not sitting in this like sadness in a negative way, and I was actually able to see a new angle, a new unfolding of my life because of the very fact that she passed away, kind of thing. I have a dog. Thank God he's okay from eating the weed yesterday. But he's all good now. But like the point is that what I'm curious about that I want to formulate to Ebert, I want to ask him is like when you bring up quality, exactly that. When you bring up quality, um, how does it change? Like, I understand the language in terms of like saturation, but how can we use his language, which I like a lot, that it's addressing this like qualitative distinction, because his language is conducive to both, but what 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 aspect of his language will point to, oh, this is the qualitative, creative way of thinking about it versus the non-qualitative way or the less qualitative way. And then like for me, like, gotta throw it in there. For me, it's the classic, oh, well, that way of thinking about it's thematic, and that other way is not so much thematic. Daniel, maybe you would know that because I think you're probably more familiar uh, with Ebert's thinking, but yeah, that's definitely something that that I'm curious about. And then also just from like understanding the different dimensions here, because I get confused a little bit. When you talk about quality like that, that's not really talking about momentum differently per se. So like what is it basically like a certain type? Is it like a bad mythos, good mythos that's like describing the momentum? Like what how do you basically categorize that mode of thinking? Where I think there's like this conflation where it's like, oh, if you're coming at it from a qualitative perspective, how you understand, quantity progression, however you want to call it, saturation. It conflates the ability to really have a discourse about the relationship between quantity and quality based off where you're coming from. If you're starting from quality, then it seems like when you talk about this quantity progression dimension, or how I would put it, like the linear versus the nonlinear, you run into problems where it's like, oh, you're talking about how like everything is like built in or pre-written in a certain sense because you're coming at it from this qualitative perspective, where like this morning I was thinking about it as like, well, it's not built in. Like quality is like a pre-coded thing but not a built-in thing, if that makes sense. Just trying to like parcel out why there is a disagreement, and I'm thinking it's because of a different starting place. But the weird thing is that the starting place, like, there's both a recognition of like, yeah, this is how quantity is understood. I agree. But then there's this next move where there's this disagreement where it's like, is there this, global telos? Is there this built-in thing? Is there this, or is it not this global telos? It's only local. And I hope I'm making sense. I'm trying to connect it to the greater thought here for me. But I'll pass it off.
No, that's a magnificent question. There's a few things that come to mind, and then I'll give it to Michelle. So first, it is very interesting that there is some sort of question of the origin and remembering the origin that seems to, and how the origin is remembered, that has a massive impact on how the present moves or continues to unfold, right? So if we're taking the example of grief, and you go, my mother is dead, and you remember primarily the loss, or you remember primarily all the good that was lost, how that which you could say, of course, is the origin of the grief, right? Well, that is probably going to have more of a holding, slowing down. And slowing down is entropic, because as something slows down, it necessarily will disperse, because then the energy moves to holding it together, as opposed to maintaining basically a statistical boundary as a Markov blanket, and it begins to disperse. And so, when you remember it that way, it kind of holds you, and it can kind of fall apart. And Clayton, good to see you, sir. Whereas if you instead go, well, I remember, the origin of this grief requires there to have been the origin of the joy, and the joy that had I not had, I wouldn't have this grief. Oh, and so this grief actually is a good thing, because if I didn't have it, it might be an indication of something bad. And what originated is exactly something wonderful that now is part of me that I wouldn't have had otherwise, right? And you kind of start thinking back on what led to the grief to kind of transform how you think about its origination and what made it occur, right? And when you think it, like you say, well, this is the next phase of life. We all know that we're going, everyone is going to die. And this opens up, horizons that wouldn't have been opened up before, and allows me to think about spiritual directions or different things that wouldn't have occurred, right? You start thinking about all of those things, of which then transforms how you think about the start, what has initiated the grief, right? And it is very interesting, because the way that human beings, humans tend to have a hunger to know where they came from, to know their origin, right? To kind of have a sense. And there's the question of, what though does it mean to find your origin with a sequential understanding of space-time, versus return to the origin in terms of time-space, where the origin is ever-present, to use that Gesper, right? What is an ever-present origin, right? Well, then that actually means what you're doing is the origin is changing with what is happening now. It's not stagnant. And if that's the case, you always have the creative possibility to sort of transform what it is to you, and thus integrate with it in a different way. And since the past doesn't exist, only your memories, then that actually is not a repression of the past. It is actually an integration of your memories with what is now the case. And then what you feel, and here's, I guess, what I'd say to that. The origin has to feel moving, just like you are moving. If the origin has a certain stagnancy, then you don't align with it, and it doesn't have the same character as you, and thus it is kind of holding you back. But if it is moving with you, because you have figured out how to integrate what have occurred with where you are now, then actually the origin moves, per se. You bring it with you, because it is part of who you are now. Where if you can't, the problem is, if you can't integrate the origin or some past event or whatever, then it's kind of stuck in your memory. It's practically as if you're in space-time versus time-space. It becomes like a spatial thing versus a process, because you have it integrated into a process, of which is your present and right now, right? If so much is about maintaining emotion and memories, then you have to integrate them into what you are now, or they become things that kind of hold you back. And I think a lot of times, a lot of people lose energy or are tired, or life becomes very difficult, because there are all these fragments or things that are kind of that are weighing on their mind, thus using energy all the time, because anything that isn't integrated into your process or unfolding is something that is thus holding back, like it is stagnant, and therefore takes energy to maintain. So the more you can integrate, the less energy you have to use, and therefore the more energy you can simply use on being, on curving, on going with what the current unfolding is. But then, of course, the question becomes how you do that. And I think things like philosophy, et cetera, or so forth become very important. I'll give it to Michelle and Javier, but on the extremely important question on the quantitative, qualitative problem and the starting point and all of those different things. So first off, we have to recognize that the only way you can quantify something is because it has a quality to quantify. We tend to think quantity comes first, then quality. But actually, if you say there are 2 apples, then you are saying there is a quantity of 2 because there is a repeat of a quality, appleness, and thus there are 2. So quality is actually original. A quality is original that then we quantify, right? So the question becomes, what is the quality that is a thing, and that would be kind of most fundamental? Because then when we're asking about quality, because I think Mr. Ebert and many individuals would warn about saying, well, hey, man, if you say exhaustion is worse than, a saturation that leads to a flow state, if you say the flow state saturation is better then the exhaustion saturation, you're making a moral judgment, you're making a subjective judgment, and therefore that's not fundamental, that's just your opinion, right? And I think Mr. Ebert would really want to stress correctly that one wants to maintain the theory at the most fundamental level, right? All right. What then is the most fundamental of all possible qualities? And I do think it's a quality, not just a quantity. Well, negentropic or entropy. This is why the stakes are extremely high on if time-space actually has negentropic potential versus entropic potential. Because ultimately, we are always choosing between increasing usable energy or decreasing usable energy. And that is qualitatively different. That is not qualitatively the same. There is a quality difference between the use of energy and there is a qualitative difference between usable energy that is ordered and unusable energy that is disordered, right? And if that is the case, then you can simply say, well, when I do this, it creates entropy or negentropy, and then the absolute choice is, of course, which do you like? And it is an absolute choice because you can't necessarily base it in any fundamental sort of underlying structure, as we were saying last week. You get to choose. Absolutely. And that becomes the direction of the unfolding. Would you like to choose negentropy or would you like to choose entropy? Choose. And I do think ultimately that becomes kind of the most fundamental choice. But of course, you have to say, well, that's nice and all, Dan, but there's no possibility of a universe that's negentropic, only entropic. And if you say that, well, then there is no qualitative, it is all ultimately just the quality of entropy in different outfits, and nothing is necessarily based on any sort of fundamental better than the other. But I actually think there is very good reason to think that the universe has negentropic potential. And I think we as subjects actually experience it. And I think you experience the difference between usable energy and a lack of energy simply because there is a clear qualitative difference between flow and exhaustion. And then if you say, well, don't make a moral judgment on what's better than the other, well, all right. One by their own experience then can determine if they prefer exhaustion to flow, if they prefer beauty to the loss of beauty, et cetera, so forth, right? And then the present can unfold as such. But I think the questions you're asking, Mr. Luber, are important, but I will pass it to Michelle and Rivera. Michelle, please.
Great discussion. I wanted to say that something you just said, Daniel, on integration made me think of something that I learned about recently, just very briefly, casually oversaw sort of thing, about integrating primal reflexes and how it's basically how to sort of resolve issues related to not integrating primal reflexes can be done with certain movement and basically occupational therapy, basically a set of movements and motions and practices that then reintegrate primal reflexes so that you don't fixate on them. For example, one of their examples is a child always dealing with kind of outburst of anger, and that being related to the Moro reflex. In babies, they do that thing, their arms just go, I don't know. I mean, we see it all the time with our baby, but if they get kind of startled, even just if you put them down, for the first few months of their life, they do this sort of startle with their arms. That's called the Moro reflex. And anyways, for example, apparently if that's not integrated, then the child can still deal later on with that and not knowing how to sort of for lack of a better term, sublate it, right? Or a rooting reflex where then they're chewing on stuff a lot, and you're that's interesting, and it's not integrating the rooting reflex. So it's very fascinating. I don't know, again, I just briefly oversaw this and I thought it was interesting, really interesting, because it's oh, maybe there's actual movement. You're talking about emotions and movement and stuff like that, but there's actual motions and things we can do with our bodies that actually help to do it's that kind of psychosomatic work to sublate those reflexes so that we're not kind of stuck in that primitive place, right? It's a part of us. We do have those. That's why we have primitive reflexes. It's for our survival, right? But we also need to learn how to work with them on the survival level and the thriving level, right? Which is the other side of our brain, which deals with creative, capacity and love and all of those things. So, because they're heavily related. In a way, love is survival too, in a sense, right? Because I just think about it if in like a traditional structure, it's like, okay, in order to be able to survive and like help, there's a deep point. It points to our deep relationality, how like you love somebody, not for just the fact that they're going to help you be able to like continue to survive, but there is something about that, like those traditional structures and family units were about actually surviving, right? And we kind of forget that nowadays because we have a lot of like ways to be a little bit more like autonomous or independent. So we forget how much like the right and the left hemispheres of our brains, even love, has to do with survival. But it does. At the same time, though, there is a sublational element to it. It's not just like one or the other. So I just want to say that, and I want to like affirm that I definitely think there's something about like having aspects of your life that you can't integrate into your everyday. And those to me would be things that like you wouldn't feel comfortable just like saying in front of everybody. Like those things you really don't want to, you kind of hide. To me, those are the things that often are such huge energy drains. And it's incredible how like sometimes people talk about energy in terms of just all the other things that like it typically gets associated with, and those are valid and not necessarily wrong. They're probably a part of it, but like it's like the sin drain. Like to me, it's like this drain of energy that can happen when it's like this thing that's not being able to be integrated because you will not let it be integrated because it's like, no, that's I don't want anyone to know about that. So to me, I think that's just like really important because it almost makes me think of like if you're trying to identify why a person has low energy, it would definitely be important to sort of be like, hey, like what's also going on in your spiritual life? What's also going on in what's the thing you're afraid of? What's the thing you're hiding? These things like can have huge impacts on your physiological health, like in your energy level or like your body. Or at least I can just say, like, I think definitely with energy and also stress, which then impacts your health too, just a second, baby. Okay. And then the last thing I was going to say, was a question. And I'll stay around hopefully to get the answer from you, Daniel, though I could ask you later. But I was kind of thinking about like the saturation, like you said, and I think that was good. Like Javier, you put in the chat about like, what was it, full versus empty saturation, right? Like there's this, because in my opinion, I think it's true what Ebert says about the saturation, but then like, why are people addicted then, right? Like, why are there people who unfortunately lived out their whole life addicted and they can't shake it, right? Like, shouldn't they have done that whole sort of saturation point and kind of hopefully gotten through it, and be free, So maybe it's just that there are different types, like there's the I don't know, maybe there's sort of like there's this dyad that work there with saturation. But I wanted to hear your answer, Daniel. And thank you all for your contributions.
Well, I think that's a wonderful question. I mean, Mr. Ebert, and I think some people may say that often addictions are a result of someone not looking at it enough or not taking seriously enough the consequences or fully saturating themselves with what this means. Often some kind of addictions can be sustained by telling yourself you're getting off of it, but not actually fully facing it. So there might be different kinds of saturation that are missing per se. And that's what's also very tricky. Like there are different kinds of saturation that can be brought into account. But what you're saying is very, very valid. The question then becomes, if there is a behavior you want to change, you kind of have to ask, what is the saturation that will change that behavior? Just not ask generally, like, what is the saturation? You could argue the ultimate saturation is beauty, right? Like beauty is ultimately the saturation that is ultimately at the end of the road, right? That if you don't have that strike of beauty, then every other saturation is almost just pointing to that effect of beauty, but you don't get there, right? Like the analogy of climbing the ladder, but never getting to the top. So one could argue, I suppose you could argue that every saturation is only as good as it leads to the next saturation per se, and the next, in so much as it eventually leads to the quote unquote strike of beauty, and the flow and et cetera, so forth, right? And then of course you could argue if you don't have the full gambit of the saturation, in a sense you don't have saturation at all, do you? Because you only have a relative saturation. So you get all of that, those kind of responses, which I think the model, like from the, it is a expanding, and then the problem is like every saturation is a full / empty. It's full and empty at the same time, right? And so it is both instantaneous, which of course, if indeed the universe is fundamentally non-local versus local, meaning quantum behavior, we also have to ask the question, when you have two quantums that are relating beyond space-time, are they a single entity? Is that a relation or a single entity? You know, together, apart, all of these sort of collapse. And at the saturation point, there's a certain collapse of the categories of full and empty and thing and apart, I and other. And that's why I think Stuart Kaufman's theory of and I actually should have brought that up last week, the non-locality is the relation that saturates to relata, et cetera, right? So more has to be said. But of course, if non-locality is fundamental, then what exactly relationships are different than what we think. So that's very, very important. You also reminded me something very important to Mr. Luber's question. Then I'll give it to Javier and back to Mr. Luber. And then anyone who wants to speak, please, right, please. Qualities are motions. Like all qualities are actually motions, right? You could argue, like when the apple is red, it is giving itself to you as red. Like you could also say that the quality of food affects your energy levels, right? Like the quality of things are the way that they are unfolding, the way that they are coming forth, right? I'm glad it's red too, right? Isn't it funny though that you associate certain qualities with making you sick? I mean, is it like you would say that apple will make me sick? Well, what does that mean? My energy will be drained. I'll waste my energy on different things. My energy will go in a direction that can be problematic, right? So there is something about quality and motion that are tied together. The kind of energy that it gives, the way things come together, qualities have a certain movement to them. And so for me, when we talk about different motions, like the movement toward disorder, entropy, or the movement toward, and in a funny way, it's not movement to entropy, it's movement of entropy or movement of negentropy, right? These are qualitative because they are actually fundamental assessments of a way of tautness, of a way that things can unfold. And I think it is extremely interesting that we tend to judge, you know, what you eat can affect your energy, the quality of your food. Of course, the question becomes is what does the word quality then mean? What are we saying when we say this is quality food? Well, we're saying that it's good as food. It's the quality of its self-relation. It's not fake. It's actually food. Isn't it funny? We start saying words like, well, it's actually food. It's not fake food, right? Oh, that's like quality pain. Oh, that's real pain. See, this is what's so funny is you almost can't help but end up talking about what things are in order to justify the quality. But then what things are qualities that you are quantifying relative to the degree that it meets itself. Is the pain actually doing a good job being itself? Is the apple actually a good apple at appleness, right? Like the qualitative and the quantitative in the self-relation of the assessment collapse. That's always kind of the issue, right? And then whatever you emphasize is ultimately going to lead you back to the other because you have to always be dancing with quality and quantity by which to discuss it. But this is the main point, and then I'll give it to Mr. Rivera. It seems extremely difficult to discuss quantity or it seems very difficult to discuss quantity or quality without ultimately coming back to something energetic that has some connection with energy. If you are talking about numbers, the number one, then it doesn't come back to energy. Oh, but wait, numbers, pure numbers don't exist, right? And when you quantify one apple, it's a quality, right? So it always seems to come back to some sort of energetic property or way that it comes forth, et cetera, so forth. And if that's the case, then to base it on the question of motion and how it moves the thing seems to be ultimately what we're always going to come back to, which I think is fitting if we're talking about energy and how grief affects energy, how food affects energy, and et cetera, so forth. It always seems questions of quality and quantity, and then I'll give it to Rivera. Questions of quality and quantity, unless you're talking about pure numbers, which don't exist, seem to always collapse into the same sort of question. They collapse, the categories collapse into one another and point to an energetic question, how the thing moves, how the thing unfolds. Is it heading toward disorder or is it heading toward order? Is it heading toward entropy or is it heading toward negentropy? And if that's in fact what's always occurring, then on the basis of that difference, one can make the qualitative choice and it not be qualitative over the quantitative. It becomes, which would be the subjective mistake or the ethical subjective mistake, quote unquote. It would be the qualitative of the quantitative that ultimately collapses into an energetic question. But Sam, good to see you, and I'll give it to Mr. Rivera here. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, so what Luber brought up about, this moral dilemma or the risk of moralization between two different types of qualities. You know, And this is where I get a little bit uncomfortable because it makes me think about, well, is energy is like, to me it's like it's too much of a scientific word, but it's so invested in motion, entropy, negentropy, all these words, so it all fits. But then it makes me start to feel like we run at the limits of this word energy when we start talking about the qualitative slicing that we're trying to make between these, because I think like Ebert and Bard would be like, yeah, we risk moralization when we're talking about there's a different quality that's better than another one. But I do think there is a way around it, possibly, which is this idea of, well, why do we assume that there's just one negative quality versus another? That means that there's not just exhaustion as a negative quality, there's another version of that negative, which we can then, I would say, then we can debate about moralization. Because I feel like, to me that makes more sense. And to me that lines up with the mean of virtue, right? Like, we can't just say eating cake is good. It's like, well, it depends, right? So it's a split already between, like, a good quality already has a split between itself, meaning that there's a good quality in the sense of it's I don't know how to put it, for the sake of itself versus like a self gain or something, right? Something like that. Um, because I think when we talk about ugliness as a negative quality and beauty, I think, to me, that's why the two sides can't be moralized, because ugliness is just beauty in disguise. And it means that you have to satisfy the conditions of ugliness to face it in order to discover beauty, which is a full saturation. So really what we mean by beauty is not even, it's like, ugliness is not the opposite of beauty. It's just, it's disguise. So when we say, oh, so actually whatever is contrary to beauty is just a distraction. I mean, contrary to ugliness is a distraction. It's ugliness that is the indicator to self-fulfill something, to encounter beauty as that full saturation. And beauty is always that full saturation. Um, and so I think, yeah, I think splitting the positivity and the negativities into two make more sense. And I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, I guess they could argue like, well, then why are we moralizing the splitting? I guess. But I feel like at that point you can just be like, all right, we've transitioned into like ethical philosophy, right? Like, we could just say like, yeah, they're all saturations, and fine, we don't have to moralize them. But now we've gone into, now we're doing a philosophy about this splitting, right? And then I can justify the moralization between the two different types of qualities of negativity, or in the two different types of qualities of positivity, of saturation. And I feel like that makes sense to me, but I mean, uh I guess I could be right. I could be wrong, but like, I think the addiction thing really made sense to me, because I feel like when you study like Eastern philosophy, like, people don't understand like detachment. Like, when you use the word detachment, it's like people are like, oh, okay, so that means I'm just like a autonomous robot, try not to have any emotions. It's like, yeah, that's actually one form of detachment, that's valid. Um, but then there's like the other form of detachment where it's more like, actually it's just your letting go, not a not caring. Um, uh, what's his name? McCabe talks about how there's a very thin line between indifference and love. And I think it's very analogous to the splitting of the negative and positive qualities I'm talking about, which is, if indifference and love are very close together, they say the same line. It's, I don't care what you do, except the emphasis is different. Meaning, the first person says, I don't care what you do. That's indifference. I don't care what you do is love. And that's how McCabe talks about it. So I feel like there is a real split in negative quality itself and positive quality itself. And it is just a matter of emphasis. And I think that can be moralized at that point. But I think once we get there, it's like, okay, we've accepted there's different saturations. We won't moralize those two, but we can moralize the splitting within those individual saturations. And I think that makes sense to me. But I'd be interested in what everybody else thinks.
No, I think, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin. I think, you could also say that if you say it's better not to have qualitative judgments, then it's a higher quality to not talk about quality, and you have all of these different moves, right? And then also, you could also say, well, for me, you could ultimately say, okay, well, even if you're not saying better or worse, if we're purely talking in terms of survival or lasting or what has the higher probability of being around, it would be that which is negentropic versus entropic, right? So if one wants to make the absolute choice that they are going to commit to a more entropic strategy, or what in my opinion would be that, then you could say that time will, it's a competition of time, right? What will survive and what will not? What will care to continue and what won't, right? So you would have the ground of the assessment would be based on life. What is around? What is there? And of course, anything that is not there isn't there. So by what standard could you say it's better? At that point that it ceased, it would not actually be around because the past doesn't exist, only memory, right? So you could make a basis of that. You could say, well, it's not really better. It's different kinds of ways of doing things, et cetera, so forth, and so on and so forth. I think ultimately it does come to the question of, yes, you're right. Energy has a certain scientific sound to it. Other words that have been used classically, like eros and love and libido and attraction and so on and so forth, right? Like there is this lovely question of where does energy come from? Like what makes energy? And if relations are fundamental, then energy has to come from relations, right? You could argue that energy seems to always have some sort of relational component. Atoms, quote unquote, different subatomic material have to relate to generate energy. Chemistry has to relate. There are things that have to have certain ways of relating to one another. And if energy is produced by relation, I think I would just say that we seem to see this with human beings. Humans tend to have energy relative to the quality of their what? Relationships. They tend to have grief and they tend to have trouble relative to the quality of their relationships. And so what ends up happening is also, if indeed energy is what things quote unquote are, and perhaps what energy is to physics, if we use the vector language, then love is to mind. Like different vectors. And then, of course, beauty as relationship creates energy. Then basically you would make the assessment of negentropic is better than entropic because without energy, a thing cannot be itself. Then it can't even be qualitative. It can't even be in the realm of qualitative because it can't even be itself, or it can't continue to be existence of terms of qualitative. So the qualitative has to be taken seriously so that we can even ask questions about the quantitative. And that is tied to the kinds of decisions that afford the relations of which maintain the energy by which the thing is itself and actually might be able to give rise to different complexities. So I think there are different bases to go about it. There are more to be said about, I also think there's something about how human beings, it doesn't seem like we can leave anything behind. Basically, like we have to bring everything with us, which means we have to integrate with us, but that doesn't mean you can't, because the past doesn't exist. Like memories are in the present, right? So whatever is with you, you have to somehow figure out how to bring with you, which means you have to integrate it. If there is something with you that isn't being brought with you, then it is holding down, right? So there is something like you have to bring everything along. You can't leave, if it sticks with you, it can't be left behind. Maybe it doesn't stick with you. I don't remember going to Food Line yesterday. That seems to, it's not with me. But if it is with you, then you can't leave it behind. You have to integrate it. There's some reason it's not just going away like the trip to Food Line, right? There is something there. The fact that it sticks is, if something sticks through time, that tends to be the test of the need for integration, right? I know they're still in business. Don't worry, Christian. And that also, I think, is an interesting, because memories are in the present. Like, it's very important when we remember something, we're not living in the past. We're living in a quality of the present that is not woven together. And so then the question is, how do we do that? But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, on this discussion of energy, guys, energy comes from the Greek for energeia, Aristotle's key concept. So thus form. Like that's the point. Like energy is form, guys. Like so it was ironic. We kind of got run away from Aristotle to come right back to him in the end. And I say that because this whole idea, yeah, is Daniel saying the thing that persists over time, right? Basically, in presence enemy disintegrated, hold together in a unity of a relation of the parts to a whole. Aristotle's concept of health applies to this. That's the point. Like the idea of a developmental form that persists over time that can allow for radical change of different functions and activity, yet still be one entity is a form. And that's the only way to have coherence of the idea of a unified relationship of the systems that make up an entity. The body basically is the elentia of the soul, Aristotle comments. So thus what I'm saying is that the body is fulfillment of the form of the end of soul, which is life. So, and then leads to Daniel's point about, again, this numeric representation of energy. Numbers come from units. Units are first. And unit is a quality. That's exactly what we're getting at. And ultimately, it's an idea of an exemplar. Kind of, there's an idea of a unit is a thing that uses as a reference for others to identify and compare to and understand. And basically, the relationship, as it's been said, is kind of oscillational quality because the measure and thing being measured have a relation to each other by that fact of the measurement. So, and that's usually, I mean, the classical Aristotle's response of, yeah, there is a moral assessment of actuality versus non-actuality. By the way, and kind of a traditionally that was the chain of being. The idea that, yeah, things have more, the more actual something is, the gooder it is. There's a justification by that argument. Now, I think another way to term this is the way, and that's the classical way to talk about it. Another way to talk about it is this relationship to lack. Lack is a kind of privational absence of form, right? So thus the not entropy, but the other one, I forget the name of it, but the egotropic, basically relationship to activity. That's kind of the other way to talk about this. Mainly because I'm going to quote from Plato on this in his later dialogues, the idea of that measure and relation, a certain proportional relationship is necessary for the pre-existence of a thing to continue to exist. An example we talked about this a little bit the last net session I was in, the idea that, you know, any object of entity has a certain boundedness of it can exist in. For example, we exist in certain temperatures. So this is actually really important because the classical tension has been the relationship, do substances have an internal movement of causation that's internal to itself versus caused by external intervention? Generally, modernity's argument is that no, things don't have internal causation. Behaviors, organic life, these are all caused by external apparatuses. Society, organics in terms of stimulus response. A more sophisticated approach of health would actually point out that it's a mutual relationship of the two. So the example typically given is that the relationship of the material form to the essential form, how those two relate to each other, there's a certain harmony that has to exist. So for example, we have a certain bodily need of certain temperatures. We can't exist in negative 100 degrees. Nor can we exist in over 1,000 degrees. We have to, we're sit within a certain boundedness of relationship. If we go to excessive or deficient on any of those material conditions, we die. We cease to exist. So that leads to, so it lets you realize that what form is a much more, again, more kind of fragile thing, is that the forms that have to exist, and the way Aristotle talks about this is the hypothetic necessity versus material necessity. For things to exist, there must be a certain actuality of a function of an end that has to come to be. And but that to be the case, there has to be certain material relationships to occur. So he's like, this is where this language of morphe versus eidos versus paradigma becomes really important. They kind of parse out this point. So for me, this is actually why I think health is a really important topic, because it points to a very deep, and it's something that it's repeated. It's actually funny that I'm doing the course on health right now for Halcyon. And it's not like there's one text from Aristotle. He talks about health in explicitly any manner. It's spread across his entire corpus. And it's actually one of his key concepts of analogia, basically of what we talk about analogical reasoning. He uses health as a constant point. And I think that's not an accident. I think because what we're talking about here is a very sophisticated, nuanced understanding of what form is by understanding health. think it's really interesting.
No, I think health is a tremendous topic. I'll give it to Clayton and Sam. And I think absolutely we're discussing form. And there's also, of course, as we've talked about before, something where I associate health in this deeper sense with intrinsic motivation, with drive, with a thing being able to be its own motion. And it's almost like you have two things, because I know we mentioned Malkoff blanket, which I associate the Malkoff blanket as well with form as as kind of statistical boundary where a thing is itself, right? Like Frisk, as I understand Carl Frisk, there's an idea that everything is itself not because of like a hard boundary that makes it what it is, but because of a statistical distribution that makes it continue to be what it is, right? And under certain conditions or intensities, as Mr. Nick Land may put it, if you get close to the sun, that statistical boundary breaks up because it breaks through that probability, right? So things are themselves to the degree that that form is itself, right? And it seems that the trick to health, and then I'll give it to Clayton here, seems to be tied almost to two questions. How do you maintain the statistical boundary, AT field or Markov blanket or the form? How do you maintain the form and keep it in drive? How do you maintain form and make it intrinsically motivated, right? Where it can actually be its own energy? Because here's the problem. If it's using its own energy, then it's using its own energy, right? And it could dissolve itself because it's not getting energy from anything outside. So it could destroy the statistical boundary, its form. But then again, if it doesn't have any internal energy, then actually what defines it could begin to break apart because it becomes dependent on something outside of it, right? So its statistical boundary may grow, right? And so you have to somehow find a way in order to maintain your form and to keep your form formulating. Like health is found in the form formulating, ever formulating, right? How does one do this? And it would seem that health is tied to that. And then if you say, if I were to venture and claim, I do think formulation is better than not formulating. And I think that is not merely a subjective preference because it is the ground of the possibility of making subjective preference. If one is not formulating, then one cannot make assessments. And so if it is more prior, then it seems to be better. Like you would have to have that occurring in order to claim we shouldn't make qualitative assessments, right? Well, then the person who wants to claim we shouldn't make qualitative assessments would need us to continue formulating to say that we don't need qualitative assessments, right? Therefore, it is better even on the terms of the dismissal of qualitative assessment, right? And so it does seem to me that the maintain of health as such is, well, the conditions of possibility by which even to discuss what is better and what is worse, and therefore it is better because without it, you can't even have that conversation. But then what is, of course, very interesting, and then I'll give it to Clayton, is that the health of formulation seems to be tied to the quality of relationships, which seems very counterintuitive because are not relationships beyond what a thing is? And yet they don't seem to be, right? We seem to hold these things together within our form in different ways, just like memory in the past. But let me give it to Clayton. Clayton, it is wonderful to see you, sir. I hope you have been doing well.
Yeah, I've been well. Thank you, Daniel. It's a great topic you guys have brought up. There's a few things in there for me, and I like the direction where we're going with adding in the relationships, because for me it seems to me like the relational aspect, like we were saying before, like all these qualities, if they have an energy or if they're related to an energy, that makes it tricky because then the relationships between energies means that they're always facilitating an emergence of a new quality. Like when they entangle each other, when they start mixing up, a new quality emerges. And now that can be novel, but then the work you're talking about, Daniel, like, integrating what was before, the memories of the past qualities that have been there, while sustaining the emerging quality, which is always emerging, I guess, which is the entropy, the ever continuous entropy, to sort of like replace the memory of the energies that were there, the qualities that had saturated before, starts to make it really sophisticated. So like from an analytical point, it's like we can try and trace, what's breaking the current experience of, let's say, reality. It's like, oh, well, it has to do with, maybe holding on to a certain memory of an energy from a time before now. Great. How do we integrate that right now? Oh, well, maybe we need to understand it better and its consequences. Okay, that's fine. But how do we know the consequences of how that, memory of an energy integrates with this new emerging energy that we don't know its properties? That becomes quite sophisticated, because then now it's like no one really knows, because we didn't know that this thing was going to emerge. Now we don't know how to work with it. And so that can end up crushing people, and you end up in that frozen state of like, I really don't know. And I guess maybe that's where, Viveki's idea of a distributed cognition can help, because then maybe you can export that to the wider network. I come to the net and go like, guys, I don't know what's going on. Help me. And then, the distributed network can then maybe use a larger scale to analyze the new relation that's disrelated, and sort of like help with suggestions of integration. But yeah, like that came up for me, and that goes, speaking of motivations, like people speak a lot about what is it, Maslow's hierarchy, the needs thing, and they try to speak about it as levels. You have to climb up a ladder of some sort, but actually, it seems like when you think about it in terms of like the emerging relationships, it's like that whole thing happens at once. Like that pyramid is like happening at once to everyone. And you sort of like have to deal with all of it. There's no way you can just deal with one level of it. And so it goes back to the same problem. It's like, how do you deal with the ever emerging, new energies of quality, through that qualitative space? And I guess it helps to know the origin, because then maybe you can start tracing, like what Jockin was saying, like it comes from this form. So we can start from there to investigate, try and find a solution, right? But the thing I wanted to point some attention to is the complexity. It's really super complex. And I guess that's why, like, if let's say someone gets stuck with it, it's quite reasonable that you should get stuck with this. It's way, way bigger than we can easily comprehend. Thanks.
No, and I really appreciate the emphasis on surprise, because there seems to be something better about able to handle the encounter with that of which cannot be comprehended or that is beyond you than not. Because you could also say that if the present is not able to handle the surprise, that of which could enter into quantification never will. Therefore, it is the quality that affords the possibility of quantification. Therefore, it is better than not, right? I think also it should be noted, before I forget, also too, I'm glad what you were saying about the entanglement, because I think it is the case that as soon as you have an entanglement, you have a quality, right? Is it possible to have entanglement without quality? If the answer is no, well, then as soon as you have an entanglement, you're going to have quality be birthed. And then the question is, do qualities generate qualities generate qualities? Well, if we start with non-locality with Kaufman, then we start with quantum entanglement, not locality of speed of light. Therefore, we start with a quality, the quality of entanglement itself, which is, of course, the quality of relationship itself, and that generates a relata, a thing. Well, a thing is a quality before it's a quantity. So therefore, you could almost argue very often, let me put it this way. Very often people say, hey, that's qualitative, not quantitative, or you're making a qualitative assessment. Well, it's almost like you should be concerned if they make a quantitative point that isn't qualitative, right? Because the qualitative is actually first. It's just very interesting. Like, we have a very knee-jerk reaction against a qualitative claim, when actually it almost should be that a quantitative claim, or a claim that doesn't have a qualitative point, is actually more concerning. Because in the beginning was the quality. It had to have been, right? No, I think I'm not. Now, that in no way whatsoever is hitting on freak theory or anything, because you could argue that what Ebert is saying is that the quality of unfolding is saturation. Like the quality is the structure. The structure is of a certain quality of how it unfolds versus another quality, right? Of maybe an autonomic universe or something like that, right? So we're not so certainly, but what's very interesting then is once you get into models almost have to fundamentally be qualitative descriptions, right? Unless it's just purely quantitative. So models are qualitative descriptions. They're just qualitative in a different way from emotions, right? Emotions are a quality of experience different from the quality of, say, of wavelength, right? But waves have a quality in how they behave, right? So when we talk about, so everything is quality in the sense that everything unfolds a way, right? There is a way by which everything unfolds, right? And so then when we're making qualitative assessments, what you're actually assessing is different ways for things to unfold. And the question becomes, what is the way that things unfold and what ways do they not unfold? And what facilitates that versus not? That has to be expanded on, but the last thing I'll say that's extremely important is it is actually impossible not to be toward the good. If you cannot choose anything that you don't think is better than something else, every action that a human makes is actually toward a qualitative assessment. If you eat the apple instead of the banana, you think the apple is better than the banana. If you punch someone, you think it's better to punch them. This is Augustine's point. There is no such thing as a bad motivation. So when we say, so here's the issue. Things are that of which unfold according to their assessment of quality. So it is not possible by which to even describe what things are unless you assume a towardness of what that thing finds quality, right? The problem is when you universalize a quality. That's the problem. When you universalize a quality into all unfoldings, that's the problem. But that mistake should not be conflated with the realization that all things unfold according to its quality, the quality of what it is, right? And so then you could argue that that of which affords the space or possibility of things to unfold well according to its own quality by the standard of its own judgment is better than that which doesn't afford space for things to unfold according to the quality of its own judgment, because that is what things are. And so that would be an assessment that seems to be fair because it is based on the being of things as it becoming according to the quality that it must be toward to unfold at all. And so then the question simply becomes how you facilitate that. And if things are indeed somehow energetic, if they are in fact becomings and motions, then decisions of which better afford that than not, ergo the healthy, seems to be fair to prioritize. But let me give it to Sam. Sam, it is wonderful to have you.
Hi, thank you. It's really nice to see everyone. I'm so glad we're talking about this. I think this is really critical. And for me personally, like I've spent probably like for the majority of the winter, I haven't really been posting too much on my Substack, but I had been working on a longer piece that I've titled Dead Body Positivity. And it kind of spiraled. Like I normally am writing between like 700 and 2,000 words, like just things you can read on the subway. But this is like more like I think like 13,000 words, because everything's like I just feel like because we are bodies, when it comes to the body, you can speak about almost anything through it as a topic. But I mean, I'm really like, which is to say, I'm glad we're talking about this, and I think this is so critical because people really struggle with this. It's a big issue. I called it dead body positivity because I like to write in narratives, and I think it can bring things down to earth for people too, rather than talking like I know like each of us have our own thinking style and writing style and these and I think we are like habituated enough with each other's thinking and writing styles and speaking styles that like I know how Thomas's idea of lack can kind of like interface with Daniel's idea. Like you've been very preoccupied with with physics lately, and I can see how all those things interact. But like, and I really like to put things in like a storied anecdotal view. And recently this year, I lost somebody. She was a really good friend of mine. And I was able to spend a few days with her while she was dying. Um, and it just like, as I was looking at her, like, you know, on the last day of her life, like, I couldn't help but see her as just a body, like, but that sounds profane, but it was like through the profanity of it, there was like just worlds of being, like, you know, every line on her face, it was like carved by, like I could see the joy and that it was carved by. I could see her mannerism of scrunching her hair like on her hands, you know, like there's such there, like earlier you were saying like Clayton, that like the Maslow hierarchy of needs is a pyramid, and it is a good pyramid because like you have so much of the base layer that, and you get so little, you know, of the point, which is joy. Sometimes just a moment of love can guide a whole life, right? But like I think a pyramid is a really bad name for it because structurally a pyramid, it like is all compressive forces where the bottom holds up the top. But really I feel like it's like a circus tent where that point at the top, it just like pulls like a column all the rest of it. It's like the reason that we can have a body that is healthy is because we have the joy that like pulls it forward. And um it's really hard to convince people that qualities come before quantities, right? It's hard to convince people that the point of the pyramid is actually the structural linchpin of the whole, you know, pyramid, because we call it a pyramid because we think of the world in as compressive, like in that pyramid structure, not in that like circus tent structure. And like, but in this particular case, my friend who I lost, she really struggled her whole life from like terrible insecurities. Like she had a lot of dislike for her body. And so to see her body at the culmination of its entire life in the form and morphology and like this beautiful, perfect treasure that her whole life created, it was like the last parting gift. Like I felt like, how could you not love this body? You know, like it's like there's, and maybe this sort of relates to what you were saying, Javier. It's like the ugliness and the beauty, like there's not really like that's not really in opposition, or like those things don't relate in the ways that we think. Like I felt like I was able to look at her body as the most beautiful, like as it in its full potential of as shining as beauty because of how much I loved her and my grief and everything in that moment. And I felt ironic and sad because I wanted her to be able to see that same body from my perspective then. And I wanted her to be able to see like mm, the like it's almost like when she was born, there were all these different decisions that you could take with your body that might give you a different form, say. Skinny, fat, you know, these things are things really people obsess about these things. You know, like a large part of people's time and attention goes towards making these various decisions to alter form. But like, I really believe that like, no matter what like path her life took, like, I feel like that body on the deathbed, it would have been recognizable to me as a particular, unique, singular person that she is, quality, you know, like it could have had many different visages. I don't know if that's a term, but like visage, but it would have been her body no matter what, you know? And it was like in that moment, like I could see through all, and also she was dying. So it was like all these things come together. And then after she died, again, why I've called it body positivity, dead body positivity, is because it's like when at the moment of death and the energy leaves the body, it is just so purely positive, right? Like it's funny because we talk about body positivity. It's like death is body positivity. It's like the word being written on the page, it kills it, you know? And like at the moment of death, its body becomes corpse, it becomes artifact, and it's like devoid of that vitality. It's like I feel like we need, and I think what we're sort of outlining today, which I'm very excited to be a part of, is like there's like a body negativity that would be really helpful for people, you know, to view their body as in like as a lack, as a negative, like rather than as the positive. And I feel like that would be like a medicinal perspective for people to see through, which is also what I'm kind of like trying to write about. And I haven't, I've polished it a number of times and then rejigged it because something doesn't feel right about publishing it, and I don't know why, but like yeah, I've been obsessing about this, and I'm glad to hear that everybody is also interested.
Beautiful. Absolutely magnificent. Well, there's a few things that come to mind. And first, that phrase, how could you not love this? I think that's very powerful. And it seems to be much of life is about conditioning oneself to be able to utter such a phrase before whatever comes, whatever unfolding occurs, which is, of course, a very high bar, but it seems worthy to seek. Also, when you were describing Maslow's as a circus tent, I think this is very good. The world does seem held up from the top, not built into. And that held up from the top, beauty, attraction, this is a classical notion, movement toward God, it's moved toward. And it does seem as if we focus very much, it's almost like sometimes with the body, we focus on the body and we call the body a temple, but we don't give it a holy of holies. So it's not a temple, it's just a building, and buildings can only be but so, you know, you're always unhappy. There's mold, there you could get new furniture and different things, but when it's a temple and it truly has a holy of holies, well, that's a freaking temple. That's a really big deal. And it's something about that holding up from the top, beauty, joy. And for me, actually, you know, very often people will say beauty is subjective. Well, you can turn that around and actually see that as a grace in the sense that that could instead mean that there is nothing that can't meet the conditions of shining with beauty, as opposed to saying beauty is subjective. Anything fat, skinny, old, young, anything. I think what we call the subjectivity of beauty is the revelation that anything can meet the conditions of beauty, right? Now, what those conditions are not random, and there is a certain objectivity to them. But what we think is the subjectivity of beauty is the sense, the grace of the possibility of everything meeting the condition of being beautiful, which to me, as I've spoken with Mr. Jockin about, and I think you said it very, very well, the more you move toward particularity, where it becomes a particular person and a particular, everything can be particular, and beauty shines forth through particularity, but weirdly, it is actually very, very hard to be particular. Like, we as human beings actually struggle to be particular. The white stone name, to be ourselves. We are like other people. We see ourselves as other people. The more we can be particular, the more actually that's a sort of meaning of the conditions of beauty. It's kind of like, always like what Peter Kreeft said. He's a Catholic theologian. And he made the point of, he said, often people think as you ascend to heaven, you become like a neutered angel, you know, male and female, they kind of all blur. It's like, no, actually, you become more like Apollo and Diana. You become more massive, you become more particular, you become more defined. It's like you're saying the creaks and the wrinkles in the face, it actually comes out the more that it's lifted. It's particular. And of course, the wild thing about the particular is it becomes infinite. It's infinite. It's particularly deep in its own way. Definitions, as Jock and I was saying, versus the definitive. Definitions can be entire, where the particular is lacking because it's apophatic, because there's a wholeness you can always go deeper to. But that is a world held up by the top as opposed to built up, right? And I think so much of health for the human being is tied to an orientation of life of being held up from the top as opposed to building up to. And I think that actually generates shine. That's where we start getting intrinsic motivation. That's where we start seeing energy. And then, of course, and then I'll give it to Jockin, Javier, Christian, and Steve, then you see basically if the universe is that which is held up from the top, then that is alignment with that, right? And so health is actuality in that way. But that was beautiful, Sam. Thank you for sharing that. And I will give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, it means a lot. I think it's really powerful, Sam, that you chose to talk about that here. Because I just wanted to add to that story. It's something about the very pressing danger of losing someone you care about, let alone seeing it kind of through that you see the excess of life itself. I say this because my father almost died about 2 months ago, about a month ago, I would say. What I mean by that, I mean, I was given the phone call, like, come now, get on the next plane, you can, that kind of conversation. The stat, like I think kind of important what Javier is getting about ugliness and beauty. Actually, most of life we're unthinking. Like there's a state of indifference that we actually operate under for most of our lives. And it's only under these extreme moments of real reality presented to you that you realize that this human being in front of you, you were actually interacting with it as an abstractional generalization, not as a real human being. I say that because it's exactly the same point Sam said. And my father still lived, thank God. But I remember when I saw him, there was a real particularity that this body in this moment, every single second had literally like infiniteness to it. I think it's actually ironically the Daniel's part about when we actually encounter the infiniteness of existence, it's actually can be very devastating. You almost can't prepare. It's almost your soul's not able to really. It's a real test of challenge of your character spiritually. How you confront those glimpses. Something we've always talked about this, right? It's sometimes a very sharp glimpse. It's very sharp, and it can be very. You realize the inadequacy of all stories, all language, all accounts, all description gets obliterated in those moments of encounter. That can really break you, but it also can strengthen you. It's possible, especially if you're given an opportunity you actually don't lose the person. That's one direction about it. But even when you lose, you realize, as Sam said, the kind of redeemableness, the redeemability of life. You actually realize how this magical thing of life, that exactly Sam said, this thing of a living body became an artifact. And you only really notice the difference when that person passes away. I only can say that because my father didn't pass away, but a friend of mine passed away years ago. I remember that. I thought exactly the same thought when I saw at his mass. Excuse me, at the wake for him. I was like, huh. I just saw. I had the recollection of this life, and then I saw this plastic thing in front of me instead. It got me into a deeper understanding of what life is. I always say that because with some shame when I was younger, I was like 9 or 8 when my grandmother, who I loved very much, passed away. And I actually remember in that event, the overwhelm of knowing the passing of the body. I couldn't see it. I didn't go to the service. I remember that from all these years. It's debatable if that was the right thing to do at that age. But I'm just pointing out, I get be empathetic to myself just because I know what was I responding to was I couldn't even face the excess of this beloved, that was when I loved, and passing away. So I think Sam's story is very important. Just reflecting on that part is, the common of philosophy training one for death. This is basically what we're getting at. Kind of what are these points of realizing kind of the tripping up in language or thought and all these categories. Ideally in philosophy, we come up to these trip up points. And I think the passing of someone we love is one of those examples of it, that maybe we can talk through like this, kind of what Kalina was talking about when we're at a complete perplexity of even how to talk about it. Just by even discussing around it, we can come to a deeper kind of maturity about how do we encounter death, how do we encounter life in that, and how do we have the right relationship with the two. I think those are important takeaways.
No, magnificent. And I'll give it to Javier quickly. And I think that idea of this dead body positivity, I think it's very powerful because it also makes me think, when I encounter a rock in the woods, I don't tend to say, how could this be a better rock? Or you don't tend to think that. It's an inanimate object. It's very interesting how we think, oh, I'm not matching up because we are animated, because we are alive, right? And in a sense, the problem is, what are we doing? We're kind of making a comparison. You could say we're quantifying ourselves. We're rating. You almost have to be rating yourself. which means you bringing it into the quantitative. Because if you were to say, I'm skinny or I'm fat and that person's skinny, why does that bother you unless you quantify yourself as less beautiful because of that, right? So part of the problem is that the human, instead of just observing the quality of themselves for its sake, brings it into a comparison that seems to necessarily require the quantifiable, that then leads to all this trouble. And if it is the case that the movement into the quantifiable causes trouble for human beings, then it is interesting that we often prioritize the quantifiable over the qualitative, which seems very self-destructive, actually. And perhaps the reason we do that is precisely what Mr. Jockin is pointing out, is because the intensity of particularity can destroy you. The particularity of a particular thing can destroy you. It is hard for me to imagine the quantitative destroying you. I can't imagine the qualitative overwhelming you, the quality of the relationship, right? And perhaps we've defined progress then in our modern society as the removal of the risk of being overwhelmed by a great experience, the removal of the risk of overwhelming qualities, right? And perhaps that is all where then this bias toward quantification is a certain protection mechanism to encountering something of a truly great quality. But of course, that must lead to a meaning crisis, because the things that can destroy you are the important things. So you are removing the important things you care about in order to be safe from the strike of the Lovecraft with the craft in parentheses. Beatrice's smile must be possibly able to destroy you and reduce you to ass if Beatrice is to be beautiful. And perhaps we have defined progress as the reduction of that danger at the cost of our souls. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera, please.
Yeah, I mean, I really like Sam's take. I mean, I can't say that was my own. But I think I experienced definitely the opposite. I mean, I experienced the horror actually side. Um, what killed me was, and it still kind of haunts me now, is just like I can't get rid of the face of just like the eyes and the breathing. You know, that face, the way I like looked at my dad when that was happening was like destroyed me. Um, and I didn't know why I was there, and I didn't understand. Like it blew my mind. Like just being like, why do people do this? Why do people sit in a hospice and just, you know, watch this thing? Um, yeah, it just but it like, you know, it's one of those things that like it definitely like just I mean, it made me realize it's so communal. Like it's only because of that. You know what I mean? It's like when you say the body's the temple, I understand that. Like that actually makes a lot of sense to me. The body is a temple, and that is where people gather together. Because I wasn't understanding that in the beginning. I was like, I don't understand why people do this. I was like, this doesn't make any sense to me. Um, but that was like just a crazy experience. But I mean, again, nobody's like, there's no one to blame. There's nothing to blame for, how people react to that kind of stuff. You know, that's why Jockin, when you say like, I didn't even want to attend the funeral, see the body. It's like, yeah, that's the hardest part. Like that's the hardest part, having to see the body. I still remember when my grandmother passed. That was like the second, traumatizing one, which is just like I had to see there, look at the body. Like I was just like, and I was a kid, and I was like, I don't understand why people do this. This is like so hurtful, you know. But it's very interesting that it comes with this like sitting down, facing, holding hands. I mean, what so kills me is like also how mysterious the body is. Because my uncle, like, he teared me up inside without even trying to, because he was like, the nurse was like, so we're going to give him medication to make him comfortable and give him pain medication. And my uncle looks at me and goes, how do they know when he's in pain? You know, how do they know when he's in pain? And I was like, I mean, there's signs, you know, there's like he can grunt more than usual, he can maybe shift more than usual, but it's like we don't really know. Um, you could attach, pulse monitor, see if heart rate increases. That's usually a typical sign of pain, but it's like, and that's when it made me realize like a lot of what the hospice nurse does is for you. And that's what I was getting hooked up on, was just like, I don't understand why I'm here. We don't know what he's experiencing, but it's everything is for you, and that was the part I wasn't quite understanding, at the time. It was just like, why am I here? Well, it's for you. But I'm like, wait a second, but I'm here for him, you know, and that's the tension there. It's like, but it's for you, it's for all of us that are tending, you know. So that was just the interesting side of that.
Thank you for sharing that, Javier Rivera. There is something about the body where everything stops and everything becomes real, and becomes serious. And there is something also in the death of the body that I think also is a revelation. One, that beauty, death, horror, joy, love, Lovecraft reduced to ash are all together, that they are all there. And why one person experiences X and another person experiences Y, is precisely, that might be when you are concerned with quality in the wrong way, because you're asking which quality response is right and which is wrong, instead of asking what is the quality of a dying loved one, of which affords this infinite multiplicity of responses, all of which do not seem wrong or right in themselves, but how I integrate with them, or what it means for me, or how I unfold from it, and how I approach it, right? And for me, then, the question you could ask is, well, what is the correct way to go from there, then, in facing it? And to me, the correct answer is courage, to look at it. And whatever the responsive is of horror or beauty, the correct step is the courage of facing it. I think we do live in a society where people put the dying in a hospital and they don't go see them. They have other people take care of the dying. And for some respects, there may be a wisdom in saying that, I'm too young to go see the dead body, or I'm not there. I don't want to judge any of that. But there is also something where if you look at yourself, or for some reason you say, no, I need to see it, that is put upon you, then the right choice, and I will say right choice, is the courage to do that. I do think courage is not subjective. I think courage is, in fact, very, very objective, because you know when it takes courage. Other people may not know, but you know. And one of the reasons it does require courage is because you don't know what will happen. You don't know what your response will be. You don't know. Clayton, thank you for being here, sir. You don't know if it will be a horror that sticks in your mind or something where you see beauty. It is a certain gamble, right? It is a certain unknown. It is a choice to face the absolute, because once you see it, it's with you, whatever it may be. And I think there are many times where in one person's life doing X is an experience of beauty, and in another it's an experience of horror, and another it is piercing. The question is not what occurs. The question is, did you have the courage to do it? And I think that if you did, then you have what you need to integrate it. Now you have to find it, and you have to go through the practices to do it, and you have to process it. But if you acted out of courage, then what is needed for the integration is there to bring it into your motion and to move and to go through with it. I mean, when my mom died, she died at home with cancer. next door, and you do wonder, should I let the children, the grandchildren see her? At what point is it too much? I mean, you're dressing them, you're medicating different things, and there is the certain, is this going to be traumatic? Is this going to be, what is the correct response, right? What is the correct way to do it? The only thing that I could ever figure rightly or wrongly is the willingness to try, the willingness to be there. Could you have been there more? Were you there too much, too little, et cetera, so forth, so on and so forth. I think the question, the courage to put your hat in the ring, I suppose, the courage to jump in, to be there, to try, is ultimately something one holds to, and I think is very, very important. And if one did have that courage, I do think, as you're speaking, as we've been speaking about these memories or these things that we hold on, I think they actually can be integrated and unfolded with us to be part of the movement, where they come to be part of the good. Because if one was willing to be there, that can never be taken from you. And that, I think, is very, very important. However hard it is, you didn't have to be there where you could ask, why am I here? I think it is indeed far better to be there to ask, why am I here, than to have not been there and to have asked, why wasn't I? So I think that's good of you, Mr. Rivera. But let me give it to Christian here. Christian.
Yeah, I think I was, I want to say 7 when my grandmother passed. And I didn't find out about her funeral until after it happened. It was a decision that my mother made, was to not have me be there. But and maybe that there was wisdom there, but even then I was upset. I it might not have been as my 7-year-old feelings would have wanted, but I was always a stickler about saying goodbye when I was a kid. That was very important to me. It was maybe symbolically important. If I had to pick up the phone or leaving, like making sure I say goodbye was important. And so not having that opportunity was frustrating. Uh, you know, I wonder if in death, because at that point the body, it's maybe easier to see a dead body as one with all of reality than a live body, because it's no longer dynamic in the same way, right? You see more clearly how it is similar to a piece of driftwood, all right? And then in that, perhaps there's more opportunity for appreciation. This is kind of what I was thinking, Sam, when you were mentioning like the wrinkles. These things stand out more. Maybe I'm speaking in a very royal kind of we. I'm not trying to speak to your experience at all, Sam, but maybe our perception is less occluded by our, also human desires, expectations, anticipations. It's just things are a little bit more laid bare because they have become still. And then suddenly much more is seen. And it reminds me of a practice I was doing for months. I did this for an hour every day, where you have a list of 200 people in your life, and you try to feel unconditional love for them, which is it is an interesting challenge. And the hack that I found was, well, what if I was going to die tomorrow? And then suddenly it became much easier. And I think it's for kind of the same reason in reverse. Suddenly, my own whatever, my basically my anxieties about someone, which I think is a lot of what makes it hard to love someone, is basically a fear that they're a source of danger or pain or whatever. Once you know you're going to die, or imagine you're going to die, that's no longer there to inhibit you from appreciating just each person as a manifestation of this one beautiful thing. And also to see the unique beauty in people. And then to kind of like round it out, I think this has recently been something true in terms of how I relate to myself as well, and in a similar but different way. Um, lately, I've been, I had this insight while, right after working with an extremely heavy dose of psychedelics in a therapeutic setting. But someone, well, I'll just put it this way. It seemed like the thing that was in the way of me being more open to something that I wanted to be open to, let's just say like a kind of deeper transcendence, was my life, like that term. And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. It just kind of like popped out. And so I've been thinking about it for 5 or 6 years now. Like my life as the thing that I must give up in order to connect to something bigger than myself. And I think there's been like maybe a little bit of a slow confrontation with what that means, and recently a more felt sense of what that might mean. And at this point, I'm like, I have the felt sense strong enough that I can kind of feel into the potential of what it offers. And it's kind of like, well, I'm going to use these words, although I'm not going to claim to mean by them what someone else might, but to die before you die. To I don't know, it feels like an incredible burden to be lifted, is to no longer be responsible to this thing that I call my life, right? Whatever, like my narrative, my whatever I relate to, whoever I think I am, this character, this avatar. Um, and but then what it feels like as I feel into letting go of that happens is that there's this non-separation between myself and reality, and then being able to appreciate myself. Uh, well, I don't know. Am I doing it for the first time? Perhaps. I want to say it's like very different. Maybe it just was non-existent. Um, but suddenly it's like there's this ability to. It's such a tricky rub here to speak about, but there's a way in which I feel an appreciation for myself, which doesn't feel egoistic. Um, it feels like an extension of my sense of beauty of reality, and goodness and truth. But the beauty is really noticeable in ways, and it's not nothing like physical beauty or anything like that. It's just kind of like this very deep. It's like a collapse. I'm at like if you could like gather up everything you have the ability to see the beauty in reality, and then feel all of that collapse within yourself, and feel it within yourself as well. And so I see here like this link with death and how death helps to um, remove these the opaqueness or the occlusions. Is that a word? Occlusions. You are less occluded um, in recognizing, I think, beauty, because the constant work of anything, yourself, another person, simply being a symbol for some idea in this framework of your story and your life or whatever, is just, it's all much more transparent. So maybe we all need to kill each other. And then we can really love each other. And of course, I mean that in a very metaphorical way. And thank you for sharing, Sam, and thank you for sharing, Javier.
No, absolutely, and thank you, Christian. I think that's wonderful, and I'll give it to Sam, and then if anyone has any final things, I will unfold chairs for the wedding and things like that. And get ready for this weekend. Hopefully it doesn't rain. We will see. I think there is something also that seems to me about what is being suggested by some sort of, there's something about health and facing death. It seems as if one cannot be healthy if you do not face death, if you do not have the courage to face death, which for me is primary. There is something about health that is being pulled from the top versus built up into. And perhaps there is something about my life that is being built up into where losing yourself in light is being pulled from the top, like the circus tent that Sam said. There's something about life then that has a certain pulling you, and it's a gestalt, as opposed to you making the whole. It is already whole. And what you're doing is you don't have even things like, I must sacrifice my life, I must make something of my life. All of those are languages of building up, as opposed to I must observe my life, or I must be my life, or I must condition my life. For the realization of itself is a language of trying to realize a quality that is latent in what is already everything. And every point is a gestalt of everything, and the ability to see it as everything seems extremely important. And also, please know, like you're saying, this first time, is if for the first time, it would seemingly be a quality that has the possibility of an ever first time. Whereas a quantifiable table you can observe once, only once, but a quality seems like it could always, like a quality of joy could always be a first time. And then, of course, that means you never get bored, and it would seem, timelessness with beauty is heaven, timelessness without beauty is hell, right? So in heaven there, it's always the first. Every moment is the first moment, right? And that's kind of the trick, is because in a gestalt, the first is also every. And what ends up happening is, by definition, that seems impossible unless you think of quality, because quality is always, quality can always deepen. You can always deepen quality. You can always have more beauty. You can't always have more cake, because eventually there's a quantitative assessment, but you can always have more quality that is beauty through particular things, right? And so you can always have the experience of something that is the first time. What's very interesting in that moment of experiencing something as if for the first time, it's almost like all time, like this unique experience of, kairos, all time gathered up, the gathering of all time versus chronos, which is experienced as the first time, because in the all time, it contains the first time. And in all time, you experience every moment as the one of one that it is, as everything is a one of one in its particularity. Well, so every moment is the only moment that will ever be that moment. It's just very, very difficult for us to experience every moment as the only moment that will ever be, because it naturally bleeds into the next, just like rocks naturally bleed into the category of rocks, people into the abstraction of people. So moments in time similarly become the abstraction of time, and we lose the particularity of moments. Whereas perhaps much of life is about really just being able to feel the particularity of the moment and the particularity of the thing and the person. And this seems to be where health is found. And then, of course, the thing that's pulling you from the top is particularity, because particularity is the window of beauty. It is through which beauty comes. I think also that experience suggests something about the Gestalt and the hologram, how every point contains all the point. And seemingly, perhaps in death, like you're saying, there's this moment of death where then it's like, oh, it's part of the Gestalt. It goes back to it. There's this feeling that even this is part of the whole, and the whole has a certain W in parentheses with an HOLE. Even when the person is lost, there is something that even that is part of the whole that I then have to condition myself to experience. But how do I do that? And it seems really hard, and it can tear you up. But you see, perhaps this is why death is necessary for the experience. Facing death is the necessity of beauty, because death is the hardest thing to see as part of the Gestalt. And if you can't see death as part of the whole, then there is an experience you can have that destroys the whole, and therefore you lose Gestalt, therefore you lose energy, you lose beauty, you lose love, you lose everything, because the Gestalt is everything. And perhaps death, I think often, like in Heidegger, and I'm not bashing Heidegger at all, there's this idea that death frames the being, right? But there's a way in which that could be individual, my death, I'm thinking, right? And so there can be an issue, but it also seems true that death is necessary for some sort of coming forth of being, right? Well, maybe a way to think about it, not that Heidegger would disagree, and I'll give it to Sam, is that the reason why we have to take death seriously is because it is the hardest thing to see Gestalt in. It's the hardest thing to see as part of the whole, because is it not a certain loss? How can you say that the whole, that everything is everything if death is there, right? What does that possibly mean? It's perhaps the edge of the mystery, the hardest thing to really, really get. But if you can't get it, and the mystery of the art and practices of doing that, then the Gestalt is lost. The idea that everything is together, beauty, it's lost. So it's the greatest challenge. And I think basically, rather than face that challenge, most people rather not. Because yeah, they can be afraid of how they do it, or how do they respond? Do I grieve too much, too little? If I believe in an afterlife, should I cry? If I don't do it, like how do I go about it? And because it brings this great question mark, people just rather avoid it entirely. And they rather not be vulnerable to death. They rather not be seen before death. But if you so run, if you will not experience that, then you've acted out of fear. And I do think what keeps us from the Gestalt, as we talked about last week, is primarily fear. Because I think a courageous mistake can be integrated. A wise act of fear, I'm not saying it can't be integrated, but it's probably a much longer road. Because that seems to be, like there are quicker and faster and slower, and maybe it could even be like we were saying with the people with hell in the Balkans and so on and so forth, right? But there seems to be, courage seems to be the activity that if you act out of, whatever follows from that, you at least have enough substance in your behavior by which to then find the resources for the integration or to how to bring it into beauty. If you do not, if you act out of fear, it is a much, 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 much more difficult process. I don't want to say impossible because that would be necessity, but it seems to be much more difficult. So I think prioritizing courage, as we've often spoken about, seems to be very important for these things. But let me give it to Sam and then Christian, and then I will have to go for work, alas. But let me give it to Sam.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, like, I bring up this point, like this, I think when we bring up these situations of the collapse of the, like the dispersion of life, it becomes like a flashpoint for a lot of what we actually talk about in this circle. We talk a lot about like about time, about memory present in the moment, and not like in the present. We talk a lot about like the universal learning process, and like I think for me, all these things, it was just a flashpoint where all these things became legible in one moment, in one real situation, where I could see that the memories were not just inside of my head, they were writ upon her body. I could see that her body was a universal learning process, that it represented a stance towards the world. It represented a grasp on a type of good. It was the instantiation of that stance and that thesis on what the world is, and that it was all here in the present. And I think it's really it's really powerful, like you were saying, Christian, that like the sense of my life, and I feel like this is sort of Kierkegaardian related to his despair. Like it is intention, like in attention between like wanting and accepting, like wanting in despair to be oneself, wanting in despair not to be oneself. There's like a middle ground that is like radically accepting. And I think that is the self-love that like body positivity really fails as a sort of political and social media movement to offer to people, is that radically accepting love of self that is inclusive of death, right? Like an idea of health that can allow death into it, and isn't like against death. It's like death is part of health. I'm reminded of a painting by Gustav Klimt, and it's called Death and Life. And it's in Klimt style, you know, a figure of death, and then beside him, just this like pile of bodies caressing and holding each other, old people, young people, just it's beautiful painting. And just this pile of bodies, I think it's so lovely to think of that as a temple. And maybe this is sort of Heideggerian, in the like intersection of two, like a collapse of quadrivium. I mean, he has earth and heaven. I forget the other axis, actually. I haven't read in a while, but I was thinking like there is a sort of like in this moment, I do feel that you get a collapsing of dyads, like the intensive and the extensive collapses when you can see their memories as a body as well. There is a collapse of self, relation to other, when love for someone else allows you to love yourself more in a more radical acceptance. And maybe rather than like defining a holy of holies that is the body, that is the temple, like rather than saying the body is a temple because it allows for, it defines a holy of holies. Well, definition is a product of like outlining of the separation layer. But rather, like if we think of this collapse of like extensive, intensive self and other, it creates a node or a center, it without boundary, you know, like that is the, it is the focal point, like the locus, the heart of like what a temple is. And it is around that people can like hug and kiss and say goodbye and see each other and see self and find body and find death, all in this like like moth swarm of just reverence, which might be, maybe that's the opposite of fear. I don't know.
No, I think, well, there's something about reverence that suggests a certain awareness that this is serious, and yet nevertheless I'll relate. So there's a certain, like, there is a certain courage in it. And it's a courage where you say, I ought to be in its presence, and have that courage, right? It brings a certain imperative that isn't simply a subjective ethical claim. I think what you're saying too, I appreciate everything you were saying about, you know, looking at death as showing the learning process and so on and so forth. I think that's very important. I think also what you're saying on the temple, like for me, what's always, of course, just following, you know, a kind of, you know, Jesus dies, tears the veil, Holy Spirit is released, and you almost have what you have when the body dies, the veil is torn and there's a spirit. Now it's kind of Holy Spirit, and it becomes a certain sort of spreading. It becomes very relational. And it does kind of, but of course, the issue is that I think some Christians may not, who follow that, may not realize is that if you start saying the Holy Spirit dwells within you, that's very dangerous. That's a very serious thing, right? Like, and that's kind of the issue, is we're not always equipped to think about what that means, right? And so also what can occur is, you know, people go, oh, if I'm close to someone and I experience their death and their spirit is quote unquote released, am I ready for that? What will I experience? So a lot of people can run and just not want to be in his presence or not have attachments or different things. But the courage to be exposed to the spirit, to be a node in that network of effect, is actually, I think, basically the only way to be healthy. I think you pay a price in the long run, eventually, if you do not face that. And yeah, maybe you get destroyed, maybe you get overwhelmed, maybe this person's death has a beauty to it, another person's a devastation. But if you're willing to face all of those, that is necessary. That in of itself is a certain spiritual practice that is necessary for the development of yourself to meet the condition of to be pulled by the top. To actually be able to work in a manner to see how these things go together so that you can have that joy, so that you can have that beauty. I think also there is something to me, a term we've used, and then I'll give it to Christian. And then if anyone has final things, please. So much, I guess, with the body positivity and any self-esteem stuff is problematic is because ultimately human, I think, health and joy, et cetera, is found in self-forgetfulness. And anything where you forget yourself, and that's what kind of happens in the spirit, where you lose yourself, you're not thinking about yourself anymore, right? The problem is with too many images of positivity, you're thinking about how do I feel? How do I look? Well, how I look is great, and they ought to acknowledge it. So you're reifying the ego boundary, right? Well, really what we want is to forget ourselves. For time to speed up, hours go by, we don't even realize it. We're fully joint attention. We're taken in something, and that's what we seek. And the problem is if we overemphasize positivity, then we actually, in the name of making us feel better, cut us off from the joint attention and the flow that is necessary for us to actually be together and to actually have that joy and that health. And so I think that is very well put. I'll see if Christian comes back because I know he had something to say, and then the internet took him. But I certainly think that the willingness, we are letting technology or experts or institutions remove from us out of conveniences the experiences we need to face in order to face something that we will then that will be surprised by and then have to integrate with. And that is very hard. It is understandable. And then I'll give it to Christian here. It is understandable why people outsource these things to experts, because they are hard and they are mysterious and it's not clear what's right and wrong and so on and so forth. Well, if it was clear what was right and wrong, we could simply program it into a computer. We could program it into a machine. We wouldn't need the human being, right? But the very fact that it is unknown and then it has to be figured out, that's why we're human. And it's simply being willing to face that, which is a qualitative experience that cannot be quantified. It is primarily qualitative. And the willingness to face that is what we really must be willing to face if we're going to be human. But Christian, would you still like to speak, my friend?
Sure, yeah. No points to be made, just some rabbit trails that popped up for me. One is an anecdote that my mind goes back to from time to time, and I believe it's a culture either in Central or South America where upon a community member's passing, the tradition is to dress the body up in festive clothing, and then they have kind of a parade, so to speak, where everyone in their village, they hold the body up and they dance with it and move it to the burial site, and everyone takes turns dancing with this dressed up, presumably heavy and kind of limp dead body. But I just always found that so interesting, and I think it's probably hard to imagine what the full experience of that is without having gone through it, and how that is as a way of saying goodbye to someone. But I always found it interesting, and I believe I'm getting that memory a little like tangled up with another a short. I don't know if you guys have ever seen Akira Kurosawa's film Dreams. I believe it was his last film, and maybe his only film in color, but it's incredible. And I believe there's a scene in there in this old Japanese village where someone dies, and I can't even remember what happens, but it's just coming to mind. And I thought, well, if you guys have never heard of that film, now you have. really good. The last thing is just again, I'm not saying something, just kind of like connecting dots, but um, the well, I'll bring in something again from working with psychedelics therapeutically. I had very much the sense in that experience of like uh, my body being a temple. Um, and at first, I was actually quite terrified about what might enter this temple, which seemed to like be coming online and almost like lighting up as if like the lights for a landing strip at an airport. Because I was like, oh God, is an alien demon going to come into me or something? I was like getting freaked out. And then eventually, it's like, oh, it's my soul. That's cool. It's been wanting to land for a while. But I came away with this sense of the importance of the body's role um, as a landing zone, the the and the way in which we can help other people feel their bodies to be a landing zone just by embodying that ourselves. Um, it's because at the end of the day, I mean, there's so many different like conditions that might help someone to facilitate some type of deep healing or spiritual experience, but I think a large part of it is just the people you're around and whatever happens there, mirror neurons or some vibes, I guess. Uh, but then it made me think of like the Mayan temples that are somehow both temples, but then maybe you've seen like the conspiracy, not the, let's say the theory that these were ancient landing sites for spaceships or whatever, right? It's aliens, History Channel guy. Um, but I thought that was like an interesting connection, like body as temple, body as landing zone. Um, and then my brain really wanted to try to find a way to fit the Maslow's pyramid into this whole aesthetic schema, but that's just the way my brain works and probably doesn't have meaning. But if you worked hard, you could, I'm sure, create a convincing argument that there is a meaningful connection between those things. Anyways, fun talking with you guys.
Wonderful. And I appreciate everyone being here today. I think there is something about that kind of idea of being a landing pad, I think is quite lovely in different things, like what will land, what will arrive. And I think a lot of it is the choice of the people you relate to. I mean, the people you relate to determines what lands within you. And so it is important to have those, to be aware of the spaces that you go into, because I think we all do kind of have a big impact on one another as the kind of landing strips that we are. And indeed, your words have landed in me today, everyone. So I certainly appreciate it. And I think that really matters. And thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.